In preparation for most sermons, and in particular this one, I read a lot of other people's thoughts on this text. I read other sermons, I skimmed many commentaries. Most of them had really cute titles, like Quite a Catch, Fishing for Christ, or by far the most popular, Gone Fishin'. Well, those get a little cheesy for my taste, but the one that caught my attention was, Get Out of Here. I don't like to judge a book by its cover or a commentary by its title, so I read on and discovered that Will Willimon, Methodist bishop, had written about this very gospel text a few years ago in the Christian century. He commented on how the crowd was pushing in on Jesus, finally starting to maybe understand what he was about, attracted to his sermons and his words. But there was Simon. Simon witnessed to this crazy, unbelievable miracle, and all Simon could say is, "Get away from me, Lord," or Willimon's translation, "Get out of here." Well, get out of here seems maybe the most appropriate response, because what do we normally say when we hear the crazy, unbelievable, too good to be true miracles in the gospel? Get out of here. Or what do we say when we hear Jesus calling us out to the deep water? Get out of here. A sarcastic yet quite honest response that we might find ourselves saying quite often to the call of God. When I was a freshman in college, my chaplain pulled me aside at the beginning of the second semester and said, "Have you considered seminary?" Well, it had been a long semester of fishing for the right major, not catching anything, cleaning my nets after final exams, wondering if all of the work was just in vain. But I was also very content in my little small boat with my communications major and my tightly held dreams to be on the radio someday. But I think God was speaking through Chaplain Brian that day when he nudged me to consider exploring ministry. "Well, have you thought about seminary?" he said again. My quick and baffled answer was, no. Translation, "Get out of here." And then I had to also ask, "What's seminary?" He explained more, and I said, no thank you. I'm very content in my small boat with my communications major and my tightly held dreams to be on the radio. But after each semester, when I was cleaning my nets, wondering if my work was in vain, he would find yet another creative way to drop this hint, subtly or not so subtly. As we were cleaning up from an evening service, he would say, "Well, we are offering a course this winter on exploring careers in ministry, in case you're interested." My silence became my way of saying, "Get out of here." But simultaneously, there was this nagging curiosity growing. And I hardly noticed that I was gradually and repeatedly being invited to go out to the deep water. This invitation came not only from Chaplain Brian, but another voice that I didn't understand, a voice that promised risk and also hope, a voice that assured me I wasn't going to do it alone. But this pull out to deep water was a much slower process than for Simon and company. It took years. It's still going on. I don't think deep water is a place we can ever get too comfortable. There are too many dangers out there, too much unknown, but before we know it, the tide has pushed us back to the shore, back to a place of the safe, secure, shallow water, until God once again calls us out into the deep and we have to decide yet again how we will respond. I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the story of how I got into ministry. And I do want to make it really clear that following the call of Jesus does not necessarily mean pursuing professional ministry. In fact, another mentor in college turned to me when he heard I was considering this and said, "If you can do anything else besides be a pastor, you should do it." He was a little burned out himself. But he was also saying, if God is inviting you to the deep waters of some other calling, you'd better get in that boat, the boat made for you. Well, when it comes to the call of the disciples by the lakeshore, each of our 4 Gospels tells a similar story but emphasizes different details which I think are really important. In Matthew and Mark, we hear a very short story about the call of Simon and Andrew, brothers called to be disciples. Jesus gets right to the point. He walks up to them. They are fishing off the shore. And he just says, "Follow me, I'll make you fish for people." That's it. They drop their nets. Jesus continues down the shore to James and John. "Follow me, I'll make you fish for people." They drop their nets. That's it. The Gospel of John, never as brief. Jesus stands on the shore and calls out to the disciples out there in the fishing boat, "Hey, have you caught any fish?" "No." "Well, just try throwing the nets in on the other side of the boat." And they were full. That's how it happens for John. And instead of Simon saying, "Get out of here," or some version of that, Simon actually gets out of there himself. He is so stunned in the Gospel of John that he jumps out of the boat. But Luke chooses to tell it another way. Jesus gets into the boat with Simon. Jesus is back on the beach in the other Gospels. He's in the boat in Luke. And he tells Simon to row out to the deep water, the only time in the 4 Gospels that it involves deep water. Simon explains they've been fishing all night and haven't caught a thing, but agrees to give it a try. And they instantly catch a bunch of fish. And we know that Simon is so in awe of the presence of Jesus that he tells him, "Get out of here." He feels unworthy to be in the presence of God, in the presence of this miracle worker, Jesus. But instead of Jesus just saying, "Follow me," as we hear in Matthew and Mark, Jesus instead tells Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." So the gift of having these 4 slightly different versions in the Gospels is that we have at least 4 different lenses through which we can hear and see this story. In this year of reading Luke's Gospel together, in this day of hearing Luke's miraculous fishing story, Luke's lens gives us some unique ways to consider discipleship. Now, discipleship is one of those words we throw around a lot here at this church. We sing about being called disciples of Jesus. We pray for strength to do it. We hear texts like today's about the disciples of Jesus. And yet, discipleship might not be one of those words you say ever outside of these walls. The 12 disciples can be put on such a pedestal in our minds that we forget just how imperfect, just how much like us they are. Thus, the task of discipleship can seem so inflated and become one of those "I'll never get it right and may as well not try" kinds of things. And yet we are somehow drawn back here to this place, to this text, to ask what it means for us. Luke's story of the miraculous catch of fish and the invitation to Simon to take up a different kind of fishing might be able to help us decode the loaded word of discipleship. Now, I hate tidy 3-point sermons, but somehow I have distilled this next section down into 3 tidy points. Okay. Discipleship in Luke. Number 1, Jesus asks his disciples to go into the deep water, but goes with them. That is key. If discipleship means getting into your metaphorical boat and going into your metaphorical deep waters, then it is crucial to remember that for Luke, the deep water happens only when Jesus gets in the boat with the disciples. Where do you sense the presence of God? Is it sometimes in those moments when you experience risk or stretching out of your comfort zone? Jesus rarely calls us to the convenient, comfortable, complacent, shallow waters. But Jesus doesn't call you to places where he hasn't gone or isn't willing to go. Your deep water is going to be different than anyone else's deep water. Being here this morning might feel like you're being thrown in the deep end. Completely unfamiliar, this might feel terribly risky, and for other people, this might feel right at home. Regardless of what the deep water is for you, here's the truth for Luke. If Jesus calls you to the deep water, he's going with you. Second, Jesus asks his disciples to be honest and then calms fears. So discipleship is being honest with Jesus. Simon doesn't pretend to be all holy when he witnessed the miracle of the fish. Instead, he just blurted out his honest, fear-filled truth, acknowledging that he didn't feel worthy to be in the presence of Jesus. Also, Jesus senses Simon's fear in this response. Simon says, "Get out of here," and Jesus says, "Don't be afraid." Jesus can take your honesty even if it seems rude. So if you sense that God might be nudging you in some direction that you just can't imagine going, you may as well be honest and wrestle it out with God a bit. Get out of here for Simon was his honest and actually a pretty humble response to nets miraculously so full of fish. When Jesus gets in the boat, you won't be able to hide very much. But your honesty will be matched with Christ's fear-calming comfort and presence. And third, discipleship might invite you to leave those nets behind, even as they are bursting with fish. Yeah, the disciples just leave their nets and follow him, and this might sound even scarier than the deep water. It's not logical for the disciples to leave. They did not sit down and calculate how much that was going to cost them in losses. Logic was left way back there in the shallow water a long time ago for them, though. It wasn't logical to follow Jesus out into the deep water after a night of pointless fishing. It wasn't logical for them to leave their nets bursting with finance and security. It was not logical, but Jesus isn't logical. Discipleship might not be logical. It's not a matter of just rearranging the pieces of our lives to make room for God somehow. Discipleship is being willing to walk away from all of those pieces to follow Christ. You might not be called to leave family or business or goals behind, but discipleship calls us to be willing to do that, or at least keep all of those pieces in perspective. Discipleship is a willingness to follow Jesus into the unknown. And I know that's terribly vague and abstract, especially for those of you grasping for some clear picture of what your future is going to hold. We list pros and cons. We get everyone's expert opinion about what we should do. We try to please family members or advisors. But all of this may not, in the end, help you feel certain. Poet Wendell Berry writes, "It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we have come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we have come to our real journey." So all I'm saying is that there may be a time when you feel drawn to do something for reasons you cannot explain, in ways that don't make financial sense or please other people, and that might be exactly what you are supposed to do. Amen.